Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to have with us today an ally in the struggle. We were just joking before we started. This is probably one of the first and only times we've seen one another not in the streets. So this is a true warrior and freedom fighter that we most times bump into each other when we're out at a demonstration or along the barricades or getting arrested or what have you. And so this will give us a chance to talk and probably give an opportunity for you all to be introduced in this audience to this great organization and the work it does, all in all of us talking in these ways, talking now even for the sake of solidarity and the beloved community that Dr. King was killed trying to establish. Joining us now from an organization known as the Workers Circle, we want to welcome Ann Toback. Ann, how are you? Welcome to Make It Plain.
I'm doing great. And I am, as I said before, I'm so grateful and honored to be speaking with you, Reverend Mark. It's incredible to be here. And of course, to be, whenever we get together, I'm so empowered by our solidarity and by your words.
Well, thank you for saying so, and I yours as well. First of all, and why don't we do this? Let's talk about the Workers Circle, what it does, and a bit about its history, if you don't mind.
Sure. And the history is key to where we are today. So I love starting there. But actually, I'll start today and say today the Workers Circle is a Jewish social justice organization that's activism, that really engages in collective activism, strong partnerships, and engagement around progressive values, around our roots. And the roots come from our founding in 1900 by Eastern European immigrant activists, all of whom came to the United States from Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, although so many of these countries were one at the time, around 1900 to 1925. They came here escaping violence, persecution, discrimination, issues that still resonate today. And most important, they came to the United States for the democracy and the freedoms and liberties that they believed it held, by the people, for the people. Yeah.
Well, that's very important because we know that this, as Dr. King would say, this long march toward justice can take a long time. And that people came, it makes a difference. People fleeing persecution, coming to this country, and still being involved in the ongoing fights against persecution and the ongoing fights against social justice today.
Yes, and I want to draw a spotlight on the fact that the members, our earliest members, our founding members, were members of a group called the Jewish Labor Bund in Eastern Europe. And this was an organization founded in the late 1800s, in part to defend Jewish communities from attacks on them, from pogroms, which were in many ways similar to some of the lynchings and the attacks that we now see and have seen in the South. These were in government-sponsored or community attacks on Jewish communities where the entire community might be burned down, people brutally murdered, raped. It was a terrible situation. And this Jewish Labor Bund was created for armed defense of these communities. And they expanded to serving as a labor organizing organization across Eastern Europe. So then they come to the United States for this freedom, for personal freedoms. They also had a strong foundation, a strong value that when they fought, it wasn't just for themselves, it had to be for everyone. So discrimination anywhere was a discrimination everywhere. And that was a hallmark of who they were. So when they came to the United States, they didn't just come to the United States saying, we're going to fight for Jewish freedom. It was for all freedom. And something we know is that one of the first affronts to them in the United States, one of the affronts, was how they saw people of color treated. They immediately they felt a connection to what they saw as the brutalization of people of color in the United States. And so they fought for many things. They fought for immigrant rights because, of course, it was very critical to them that their own families, their own communities have access to the United States. And of course, our borders were never open without threat of being closed. They fought against fascism because, of course, fascism, authoritarianism rule was what drove them in part out of their home countries. And they fought for the democracy and the right to vote. And they were very involved in the early labor movement in the United States in the early 1900s. And one other interesting, I think, fact is that in the early days, once they had achieved some labor victories between 1910 and 1915, this is primarily immigrant women members and men, many of them transitioned into the suffrage movement, fighting for women's rights. And then it was a natural fit that later on they transitioned into the civil rights movement. This was always, the right to vote, the right of democracy was a key piece of their activism. And we've always been an activist focused organization. And of course, now we define as a social justice organization.
So I love to go through the history. Let me just ask you use the term labor bund. Am I
Yeah,
pronouncing that correctly? So
yeah.
what does that word actually translate to?
It actually was an organization, the Jewish Labor Bund, BUND, and that, I may be giving it a Yiddish pronunciation because Yiddish was their language of choice
Right.
in Eastern Europe. It was an organized group whose focus became on the rights of workers across Eastern Europe. So when they came here, they actually joined groups like the ILGWU and Amalgamate. So they became involved in the union movement. People like Sidney Hillman were Bundists in Eastern Europe. I know. It's funny. My great grandfather was emigrated from the Ukraine in the early 1900s and became an activist in the ILGWU. And I didn't grow up learning about the Jewish Labor Bund, but it was a major piece of history at the time. So it's something we're just reconnecting with. I'm just reconnecting with, but of course the worker circle has always been connected.
And it makes sense because there's always been the intersection between cultural issues, social justice, civil rights, and labor and
Yes,
organized
yes,
labor. And
yes.
so if folk got here right at the turn of the century, I mean, we know what was going on and what was not happening on
Oh
behalf
yeah.
of laborers,
Mm-hmm.
particularly women. Uh, Even here in New York, we're in New York today, folks. So that's very, very important. You also mentioned Yiddish.
Yeah.
Part of the mission, and obviously still is for the Jewish community to maintain ties to its roots. So
Yes.
you all focus on the culture and the language of Yiddish too, don't you?
Yes, and the history, the activist tradition, and the tradition of resistance. That's something that many people don't connect the dots on for good reason. I think it's too often been fallen by the wayside. But our Yiddish tradition is this tradition of resistance and being part of a fight for equality. It's very much embedded in that history, and you can see it again and again and again through World War II, when, for example, this Jewish Labor Bund, the people who were still there were part of some of the very famous uprisings that are still spoken about. For example, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They were one of the leading organizations on the ground fighting the Nazis. So I want to mention something that really struck me. So I just came back from an incredible march in Alabama. We marched. There was a week-long march from Selma to
Right.
Montgomery with different organizations taking on different legs of the march. And the Workers' Circle was so honored to be marching with Black Voters Matter. They were the leading organization. We were a co-sponsor. And during the break, we had a learning session during lunch, and a group of people who had been activists on the ground in Selma to Montgomery 57 years ago, spoke to us about how white landowners had basically evicted Black workers, Black residents from their homes during that period of time if they participated. And something they touched on in discussing was that they lived in a tent city on borrowed land, on land that had been provided to them by somebody who was sympathetic to the movement. And they talked about armed resistance. And something that strikes me in Black history and Jewish history is very often the fact that we do have traditions of resistance, and in fact, armed resistance is often forgotten. Our people were very involved. We have traditions of strong activism. So I think that's something we need to bring to the forefront altogether. And remember, like many of our traditions, we have different traditions of culture, of heritage, but activism is a key connector.
And yes, it was. It meant a lot, and it means a lot to have your presence at these events, and you all were very prominent with us on that march. But that also speaks to your point. Historically, many of the civil rights struggles, especially those in the 60s, were won because of the solidarity that existed between our communities, weren't
Yes,
they?
yes. And I actually want to take it one step further and say most of the great social change movements have only seen victories when it comes through broad and strong partnerships and coalitions. And that is, of course, one of the most important, the civil rights victories that were achieved in the 1960s. Were, of course, part of a strong partnership. And right now, there's nowhere that the worker circle would rather be than standing shoulder to shoulder, with such incredible and inspiring activists.
Yeah. And we're all happy to stand shoulder to shoulder with you. And I think we should acknowledge, folks, when we talk about the current assault on voting rights, there's sometimes the assumption that it exclusively affects African Americans or Latinos. But written in all of these state laws, there are a lot of little things too that
Mhm.
affect not just voters of color and not just low income voters, but women
Yes.
and seniors. I mean, some of these states and are thwarting the ability to get absentee ballots in the mail
Look at
to
what just
mail
happened.
them back.
Look at what happened in Texas, where didn't they throw out like 40% of the absentee ballots in this last
That's right.
primary? I mean, yeah, thwarting, rejecting the scope of this is astronomical. And I mean, it hits so many populations, including the disabled, preventing access to easy access to the ballots. But most of all, when people hear about this, they need to understand that it impacts us all.
Yeah.
Um, the last election would have been very different if all of the votes that now are likely to be discarded or prevented goes through. I mean, elections are going to change if people can't get to the ballot. We're talking about millions of voters who are likely to be obstructed
Yeah.
at this moment. So it's a crisis in now. It's
Yeah.
not in the making. It's happened, and I think it's one of the biggest crises. It's the biggest crisis of our democracy. It's hard to parse out how many crises we're facing right now. But I believe the right to vote, this is a pillar of our democracy, and it's in immediate jeopardy. And I think everybody should be taking a stand. Not just, there's so many reasons to do it because of the overt discrimination, of the overt bigotry, but this is a grab at our democracy in favor of authoritarian rule.
And it's almost as if what some of your ancestors and those who immigrants came here escaping persecution in Eastern
Hmm.
Europe, it's like there are those in America who want to take us back to that time with authoritarianism, with the
I
fascism.
think so. And we saw this during the last presidential administration. We saw authoritarian rule on the streets. We saw and it wasn't we saw overt racism, bigotry, some terrible attacks. We saw anti-Muslim. We saw an anti-LGBTQ, which is continuing. Look at what they're doing across the South and other places to the LGBTQ community. I mean, what had just happened in Florida with the don't say gay legislation. I mean, we're experiencing attacks that we wouldn't have imagined 8 years ago. And we saw a huge rise in anti-Semitic attacks in those days. From our perspective at the Workers' Circle, all of these attacks came from the same roots. So we can't we can't cure any one of them without curing all of them. So our approach is to fight all of these forms of discrimination. But something that's very important to us now is to be part of the national movement to end systemic racism, because that really is, I think, also an overarching issue that's impacting all of this. And when systemic racism is allowed to flourish in our country, I think we should assume that every other marginalized group is going to be impacted and going to be pushed down alongside it. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're not that any of these pieces can be allowed to exist without a degradation of our entire democracy and society.
No, very very well put, folks. This is the fight that we're in, and let me just say there are those um, in this authoritarian setting, ladies and gentlemen, that do not want our communities to be unified, that want to continue to draw out division and set us against one another. But what Ann just said is right. Um, for every assault against the LGBTQIA community, it is also an assault on the Black community, the Jewish community, the Latino community, and vice versa. When there are acts of anti-Semitism or violence at synagogues, that affects us all, and this is why we must stand together. And it's no, we talk a lot about what happened in the aftermath of the civil rights movement as we approach, as we're in the season of Dr. King's martyrdom, the anniversary of his martyrdom and ascension. By the way, and people say anniversary of his assassination. I don't think you anniversarize an assassination. I
It's
prefer to say
interesting,
anniversary
yeah.
of his martyrdom and ascension.
Mm,
We should not be naive because we talk about what happened to him and we talk about COINTELPRO, but I also think there was an agenda because of the solidarity that existed between the Black and Jewish community and the civil rights movement. Abraham Heschel, you
yeah,
marched with us this month, but Abraham Heschel and other rabbis were marching in 1965.
yeah,
I don't think we should be naive. There was also an agenda to say, well, we got to break that up. We
yeah,
can't have them together, and so what the worker circle is doing now, folks, with Black Voters Matter and all of us in the civil
mm,
rights movement is rekindling that. But let's not be naive that that's something we have to continue to
yeah,
uphold, defend, and struggle around, lest there be those in these authoritarian settings who would want to continue to set us apart. So, Ann and I aren't just chit chatting.
yeah.
This is important work,
Hmm.
and
Oh,
all of us have to see. And I'm telling you something else too. And lastly, I think people also should understand. We're talking about voting rights, which overlaps and intersects all of this. But folks, and this just two constituencies. We won't even get into all the others. I don't have all those numbers, but we know this: 90% of Black voters vote the same way as 70% of Jewish voters. So
hmm.
wait a minute, and we don't meet on that. It's not a meeting, and I don't call a meeting and say, "Hey, Black voters, and Jewish voters, y'all vote this way." That's even organic, which means we have more naturally in common than we often dialogue about. That is just literally how. Am I right, Ann?
Oh, I think you're right. Now, I have to say, I work for a 501c3, so we don't tell people we're issue based.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But I think but I can just counter it and say the issues are similar and the issues are critical to us all. Yes, we have so much more in common than I think is elevated by the news media and others. And I can't support what you said enough, Reverend Mark. It's keeping us divided is definitely on the agenda of the right-wing fanatics. I mean, we are so much stronger together and we're more powerful together. And not just us, as you said, it's bringing in the Asian community and every other community out there, the Arab, the Muslim community. I mean, all of these different communities. We are weaker when we're divided, and I think there's some intentional divisions that are being set up. And when you see how we work together and how we march together, I don't think it's being properly presented by the media out there. And I think there's more eyeballs attracted when it's about division versus standing together. So for people who are watching here, I mean, let's stand together. And if we have differences, let's examine them. There's no reason we shouldn't have real discourse. Good dialogue is also something we should embrace. We don't have to stand together on every issue, but we should be able to talk together and learn together and grow together.
Indeed, indeed, and all stand with and for each other in solidarity. Us,
absolutely,
all
because
these communities. Yes,
we'll go we will ascend to to leadership together, or we'll fail together. This is, I want to just also comment on, you were talking about, we look at the last civil rights movement, and we're really in a renewed movement. This is a lifetime commitment I think we all have to make and pass on to our children. And one of the things we do at the Worker Circle is we're training high school and college students and families to pass these values of activism, a commitment to lifelong activism, generation to generation. I think one of our learnings has to be we can never rest on our laurels. I am focused, as I know you are, on the next victory, the voting rights legislation, defeating these these terrible voter suppression laws that are being approved state by state by state. Once we have those victories, we have to be committed to continuing this dialogue and continuing our activism, because we have to presume there's always going to be people who are looking to take these freedoms away. And that's something I think we should all commit to as well. We have to, activism doesn't have to be a negative, it's a positive in your life. You can do it alongside your day-to-day world, and it really empowers every part of your life. So I think lifetime activism is something we should embrace together.
that's right. It was Frederick Douglass who said it's all about eternal vigilance.
Yes, yes.
And we're going to do that, and Worker Circle is definitely doing that,
Oh,
continuing this
yeah.
legacy since the turn of the century in 1900. We're in another century now, aren't we? So that would be that
We
performance.
are. This is our second
Second
century.
century. That's amazing. That's amazing and wonderful history. Folks, go to the website. I'm fascinated with the history. Read about the history there. It's very well documented. And also all the issues that the Worker Circle is involved in. And again, everywhere I've been in the past year fighting for voting rights alongside Black Voters Matter, Worker Circle has been there as well. And we're thankful for that. Go
Well,
to
we
Circle.
wouldn't be anywhere else.
And I know it. We love it, and can't wait to see you again, folks. We invite you to go to circle.org, follow, find out more, get involved
Yes.
as well. There's so many ways to get involved, and Worker Circle offers that as well. Circle.org.
If I could just put one plug in, I think every Wednesday right now, Wednesday evening, we do phone banking to different states. And what we're doing is, and we work with Black Voters Matter and the Center for Common Ground. And we do these weekly phone banks. We do it together. So you get on a Zoom, you talk, and then you make your calls. And it's all about empowering voters who are being subject to suppression in different states, just making sure they know how to cast their ballots, where they can go. It's a great way. If you have an hour on a Wednesday evening, you'll see that information on our website too. Just come and join in.
No, that's important, folks. Yes, please, circle.org. Uh, get involved. I know many have busy schedules and work, but we can all phone bank from right where we are at home.
Exactly.
And
It's a
that's important.
fantastic, it's very easy and it's really, everyone loves it. I love it. You just make a few calls. The people who answer the phones couldn't be, I mean, almost always, they're thrilled to talk to you. You get a chance to talk and learn more about people, even as you're helping, you're directly helping them. And just if you go to Workers Circle on Facebook, we're also on Twitter, just to keep in touch because we do a lot of activism and we're always happy to welcome people who want to join us.
And those things, folks, Ann and I see each other out in the streets all over the country, but we both live in New York.
Yeah.
And so again, so pray that we will find a way to see one another here in New York and grab a bite, not just on the streets, in the streets, and in jail. Uh,
Yeah.
it's good to have relationships with people outside of jail too. You know, that's healthy.
It's
Uh,
all about creating community together. And of course, food is a good part of
that's
that.
right. That's right. So this is a coming together for the two of us
Yeah.
as individuals, and appreciate your work, appreciate your time for being here with us today.
Thank
Uh,
you.
and I'm with Worker Circle all the way. Okay.
And right back at you. We'll be together through the next victory. I'm looking forward to celebrating.
Folks, check out circle.org.